Welcome to This is Getting Old, moving towards an age-friendly world. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about ketones, diet, and beyond. So lifestyle, healthy brain, and aging and Alzheimer's disease with Dr. Mary Newport. So welcome, Mary. How are you? Or Dr. Newport?
Hi, I'm great, Melissa. How are you doing?
I'm great. So before we get started, maybe just introduce yourself to the listeners.
Okay. Yes, so I am Dr. Mary Newport. I'm a physician. I practiced newborn intensive care for 30 years. And I, during that time, became caregiver for my husband, Steve, who had early onset Alzheimer's that started when he was 51 years old. When he got to the later stages, I started doing hospice care and did that for nearly 3 years. This is while he was in hospice. And then he did pass away from Alzheimer's, but I think we'll get more into that with his story. And then more recently, I did home health risk assessments for Medicare and Medicaid. People who are on Medicare might have a nurse practitioner or a physician come to their home to review their medical history and medications and make recommendations about nutrition. And I really loved that job. I loved it. And unfortunately, the pandemic kind of nipped that in the bud because they were elective visits.
Right. All right. So you said that you'd practiced for many years as a newborn specialist. So
Right.
how did you get in? And you mentioned that your husband had Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
So what got you really interested in the ketone aspect of Alzheimer's? Because right now we know it's the only disease that can't be cured or prevented or slowed down, except that some of that science is changing around the prevention piece.
Right.
And so
Right.
let's talk a little bit about what you discovered with the role that ketones play in trying to
Mhm.
prevent and or slow down a little bit Alzheimer's
Okay.
disease.
Okay. Well, the first thing that happened around 2006, I found a paper that said that people with Alzheimer's who ate the most Mediterranean-like diet lived on average 4 years longer than people that ate the least Mediterranean-like diet. And I thought, this is the first time I saw anything about nutrition related to Alzheimer's. So that kind of set us off on eating a healthier diet, Mediterranean type diet. But then in 2008, he was still going downhill. I improved a lot. I lost weight. I was feeling better, but he continued to progress with his Alzheimer's. And he was going to try out for clinical trials, two different drugs that were aimed at reducing beta amyloid plaque, these plaques in the brain that are characteristic of Alzheimer's. And the night before one of his screenings, I got on the internet to look at the risks and benefits of these two medications that they were going to be trialing. And I came upon a press release for a medical food that was going to come out about a year later. And it claimed to actually improve cognition in nearly half of the people with Alzheimer's that took it. And you never see that about the Alzheimer's drugs. Even all of the currently FDA-approved drugs claim to slow decline, perhaps for 6 months or so, but none of them claim to improve cognition. So I had to find out what this was. And I found the patent application, and I found out that it was a food called MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil, and that this oil was extracted from coconut oil. And I actually knew what MCT oil was because I'm a newborn specialist. We used to add MCT oil to the feedings of our tiniest preemies to help them get home faster. And it worked very well. And then the formula manufacturers started incorporating MCTs, medium chain triglycerides, into infant formulas as MCTs or as coconut oil. This was in the 1980s. And part of the reason they did that is because MCTs are in human breast milk, and they play a very important role, in building the lipids in the newborn brain, the ketones from that. And so when you consume MCT oil, your liver converts part of that to ketones, regardless of what you eat. And ketones, many people think, oh, those are harmful. That's terrible. You hear about them with diabetic ketoacidosis, but we're talking very low levels of ketones. They actually, during prolonged fasting or starvation, you break down fat in your body, and part of it is converted to ketones, which your brain can actually use as fuel and does use as fuel. During prolonged starvation, there are studies showing that the brain can convert over from using glucose mainly as fuel to using ketones as fuel for about 2/3 of the energy needs that the brain has. And the brain is a very active, energy needy organ. So the idea with using MCT oil is that it increases ketones and it can provide energy to the Alzheimer brain. And that's important because in the Alzheimer brain, there's a problem with glucose getting into the brain and getting into areas of brain cells within the brain. And this is most likely a very big reason why people with Alzheimer's decline. It's a major factor in Alzheimer's. And if you can provide energy to those cells, then perhaps someone would improve cognitively, maybe slow it down, maybe even prevent it for people at risk. So a group in Canada since then found that, in fact, the Alzheimer brain does take up ketones normally. And the difference is that with glucose, insulin is required to get glucose into the brain and is directly or indirectly related to getting glucose into cells. And there's insulin resistance. It's a type of diabetes of the brain. So I learned all of this in this patent application. And then I thought, okay, this is something I need to try with my husband. And he happened to be trying out for clinical trial in the morning. It's about 1 a.m., but I couldn't do anything about it. And we took him for the testing. And he scored very poorly on the mini mental status exam. He needed 16 out of 30 points. And he got only 14 out of 30 points. And we were very disappointed. They asked him to draw a clock. And this is the clock that he drew. I'll see if you can see that.
A little bit higher.
There it is.
Yeah.
Doesn't look much like a clock. It's very disorganized, a few little circles, a few numbers. And the doctor told me he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. So I thought, what do we have to lose? I knew I'd seen coconut oil on the shelf. I hadn't seen MCT oil, although it was available online. I didn't know it at the time. And I figured out how much coconut oil we would need to give him to equal the amount of MCTs in that medical food. And the next day, he had another screening for a different trial, different location. And this time, I gave him, it was a little over 2 tablespoons is what I had worked out of coconut oil. I put it in some oatmeal. It is a little solid at room temperature, kind of creamy, and it melts very easily in anything warm. So I put it in oatmeal. He ate this, and about 3 hours later, we were in Tampa, Florida, a different location, where he was again tested for a different clinical trial. And this time he gained 4 points. And he scored, there were things like the day of the week, the season, where this was located, what floor he was on in the institution. And he got those all right and brought his score up to 18 out of 30, and he qualified for the trial. So I was pretty astounded, and I thought, well, I don't know if it was just really good luck or prayers or, the coconut oil, but kept it going. And the next day I just started getting everything I could, recipe-wise, cookbooks to learn how to use coconut oil. And then I thought, one of the things I learned from the patent application is when you take MCT oil, the ketone levels peak at about 90, like an hour and a half or 2 hours, and then they're pretty much gone after about 3 hours. And I thought, why just 1 dose a day, which is what the medical food was tested for? Your brain needs fuel 24/7. So I kept the little over 2 tablespoons for breakfast, but then started cooking with coconut oil the rest of the day. And so that he would get, more opportunities to make these ketones and help his brain. And he just started improving like every day. We were just kind of shocked. He would come out. He was very aware that he had Alzheimer's, what he'd been able to do and what he could no longer do, very frustrating and depressed about it. Mm-hmm. He told me it was like a light bulb came on in his head the day he started the coconut oil. And I've heard that from other people since then too. His mood improved. He started having hope again, for his future. He'd come down the hall instead of very sluggish and non-conversational. He started kind of bouncing down the hall, very talkative, whistling, telling jokes again. he had trouble before this getting utensils out of the drawer. He'd be confused. He'd, go to get a spoon, and he'd come back with a knife, and he would do this over and over, couldn't figure out how to get water out of the dispenser from the refrigerator. He was able to do that. He had tremors when he spoke. He would, I think, lose his train of thought, but his jaw would also tremor. That went away immediately. We never saw that come back. And he had a hand tremor in the morning too. When he would try to eat, he had trouble eating. He really couldn't keep anything on a fork. And after he would have his coconut oil 20 or 30 minutes later, that would go away. And then over time, 2 weeks later, he drew another clock. See if I can get this one on there. And you can see quite a bit of improvement there. There's a whole circle.
Right. Well, yeah, from the first one.
There's a bazillion hands of the clock. And then there's another one. Let's see, about a month later. It's a little cleaner looking, a little neater. And so that was just one thing. He tried again for the other trial, and his mini mental status score was 20 for that time, 20 out of 30. So it came up even more. And he was accepted into both trials, which turned out to be unfortunate, but we got to choose what trial he would be in, and he was on coconut. And then I started adding MCT oil about 6 weeks into this when I found out that I could actually get it. And I had made a connection in the meantime with Dr. Richard Beach of the NIH, who was a world expert on ketones, and he had been developing a ketone ester. And he was quite astounded that someone with Alzheimer's would respond to such low levels of ketones that you get from coconut oil and MCT oil. The ketone ester can increase levels 10 times higher in 30 minutes. And this was something powerful he was working on. He hadn't been able to get funding for a clinical trial. He was trying desperately to do that. So he was very interested, and I kind of became the messenger for his message, trying to get funding for this ketone ester to be developed. And basically 2 years after we started the coconut oil, my husband became the first person with Alzheimer's in a pilot study of one person with the ketone ester from the NIH. And he had had some setback at that point, and he had a dramatic turnaround very quickly, able to very next day do things for himself, like pick his clothes out and take a shower and shave without me standing there supervising each step. And it was quite dramatic, and it maintained him for another 20 months before he had a big setback that was unfortunate. And I should tell the rest of the story. I say that story has a happy middle, but not a happy ending. Steve started having seizures, and this was almost 4 years after we started the coconut oil. So we did get almost 4 better quality years. But he had a seizure. He fell straight back. He was standing, hit his head, had a 20-minute seizure, stopped breathing, turned blue, had to be revived. I was actually at the hospital. I was called back home by the lady that was taking care of him, and he had another seizure on the way to the hospital, and unfortunately he became completely dependent after that, and he passed away about 2.5 years after that with from Alzheimer's. It was directly from Alzheimer's disease, but we kept the ketones and coconut oil and all of that going in the meantime, and so the story does have a sad ending, but he was at between stage 5 and 6 out of 7 at the point we started this. And, in the very beginning, I thought, if my husband improves, other people will improve. And maybe the earlier you start doing this, the more, the better this will work. And it possibly might even be a way of preventing it, for people who are at risk for Alzheimer's. And basically who's at risk. And this problem with glucose uptake in the brain starts happening 10 to 20 years before you have symptoms. So a lot of us have Alzheimer's cooking in our brain. We just don't know it for a long time.
Right. So you mentioned a lot of great story, and I think you did a really good job of explaining kind of the brain energy gap within the brain.
Right.
Just wanted to let people know, if you can't see the images that she was showing you of the clock drawing test, you can watch the video on YouTube. But you also have written a book called Clearly Keto, and it sounds like those images, you were holding up the book so that people can see. But I also have
Right.
another podcast I did about how Alzheimer's disease is diagnosed, and the mini mental state exam and the clock drawing test are two common screening tools that
Right.
clinicians use. And in clinical trials and research studies, those are instruments that have proven to be reliable and valid to some extent, depending on literacy levels and that type of stuff. But they test different parts of your brain. And, so people can watch that video if they need to understand what a mini mental state exam or what a clock drawing test is.
Mhm.
And then the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is, what about the role? You mentioned the Mediterranean diet,
Mhm.
and have, George Washington University has a culinary medicine institute that teaches people how to cook with that Mediterranean diet. So I'll include a link to that. Dr. Tim Harlan has also done a podcast with me on his work. So we talked about the role of the Mediterranean diet, and now this role of ketones and the MCT oil. But you've also talked to me about a third factor of inflammation. So maybe talk a
Right.
little bit about the role of inflammation.
Right. So, inflammation is also a major component of Alzheimer's disease. And you don't have Alzheimer's without inflammation in the brain. And for example, many people will develop mild cognitive impairment as they get older, but only about 15% go on to develop Alzheimer's or other type of dementia. And one of the transition points they have found with using PET scans that can look at inflammation in the brain is that at the point that somebody with mild cognitive impairment develops inflammation, this seems to indicate that they're on their way to progressing to Alzheimer's disease. So inflammation is very, very important. Insulin resistance, which is related to that problem with glucose uptake, can actually cause inflammation in the brain too. So as that worsens, that can happen. Chronically high blood sugars, eating foods with high fructose corn syrup. Those are other, these highly processed foods that are full of refined grains, which are about 90% sugar, like white flour it doesn't taste sweet, but it converts to sugar in your body. A lot of, ultra processed foods have high fructose corn syrup is very, very common, and they're very high in sugar. They're very high in salt. They taste great because they're designed to want you to eat more, but they're very bad for you and inflammatory. The Mediterranean diet gets you away from all that. It's a whole food diet. You think of whole foods, your vegetables, fruits
Yeah.
in their
The
natural
way,
form.
yeah. Well, the way I've
Meat,
always described that, I think I tell people I
right?
learned it on like Sesame Street. It's like, a whole food is just something that comes in its own wrapper. So,
Right.
and they're usually
Right.
around the outside of the grocery store. So they're
Yes.
easier to see. And then
Yes.
everything processed comes in a box. So
Exactly.
I know that sometimes it's hard for people to understand when we say processed food, like what does that
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
versus a whole food diet. So if it
Right.
comes in its own wrapper, that's
Hmm.
usually a good indication, or in its as
Yeah.
close to its original form.
Right. And some things, I mean, technically, washing and packaging fruits and vegetables are a form of processing, so I think of it as minimally processed. You can look at a label, like Greek yogurt. It just has, the milk, the enzyme to make it, that type of thing, very simple food. So there are some foods like that they have to be processed. I mean, a lot of foods have to be cleaned. They have to have debris removed from them, for us. Unless you go to a farmer's market, they do have maybe some of the debris washed off, but basically very minimally processed, mainly for packaging types of foods and nuts and seeds, legumes, things like that. And my husband and I, we ate a convenience food diet up until 2006 when we converted to the Mediterranean, and we both, I mean, physically, we just felt much better. I lost a lot of weight. easily and not hungry, not craving carbs all the time. It's a naturally, because you're eating whole grains, you're not eating refined grains. It's also what's called a low glycemic index diet. The carbohydrates that you eat that are whole grains, for example, they don't spike your blood sugar, and which spikes your insulin level. And over time, when you do this over and over and over, your cells just don't respond to insulin normally anymore. That's part of what creates insulin resistance. And it is possible with a Mediterranean diet and also with a ketogenic diet, low carb diet, to reverse this problem of insulin resistance. There's a physician, for example, at Duke University, Eric Westman. He's been helping people with type 2 diabetes for over 20 years go into remission completely. Their blood sugar, hemoglobin A1C come back to normal. It's a very low carb ketogenic diet, but it's whole foods. It gets away from the processed foods, and people get completely off insulin, off their diabetes medications by going on this diet. It's a very simple diet that he recommends. It's very easy to follow. I've used it myself, basically to try it out. People lose weight, they feel better. You get away from the carb cravings. When you eat fewer carbs, get away from refined grains, sugar, fructose in your diet, it tends to, basically reduce the carb cravings as well. To me, that was like one of the greatest benefits, because when I was eating a very low fat, high carb, processed food diet, I was hungry all the time. If I'd have a bowl of cereal, I thought it was a healthy cereal because it had fiber in it, and it had the American Heart Association healthy heart check on it. But I just immediately wanted another bowl of cereal. And I was eating skim milk with it too. Whole fat dairy helps absorb things like calcium. There can be plenty of calcium in skim milk, but you don't absorb nearly as much of it as if you eat really the full fat milk or yogurt or cheese. If you eat reduced fat everything, there are a lot of important nutrients that you may not absorb. So just some things that I've learned over time.
All right. So we've talked about ketones. So what are some ways to increase ketones? And the other part of it is I want people to be more balanced in this approach, because sometimes you tell people, start taking ketones and then they go to the extreme, which then you end up over vitamizing yourself or over supplementing yourself, which can cause a lot of problems. So what are the kind of simple things to do without going overboard and giving yourself more problems? Because this is something that affects a lot of people, and a lot of people are desperate to try things, but that has to be balanced with really with a whole food diet. So you do the Mediterranean diet, and then what are a couple of other supplements that would make sense without going overboard? Because it's really like it's a whole lifestyle thing. Like you can't just take coconut oil and it's going to solve everything, which is what most people want from any providers. Like, give me a pill, let's fix it. So this is really part of a whole lifestyle change. So learning more about the Mediterranean diet, and then, what are some other things that people can do that's in a balanced way without causing problems? Or what are the problems if you take too many ketones?
So a ketogenic diet, there's a wide range of what can be considered ketogenic, from mild nutritional ketosis, which is where I suggest people aim for, and to very deep nutritional ketosis, which may be needed. The ketogenic diet has been around for 100 years, and it's successfully helped people with epilepsy get their seizures under control. And the strictest form of the diet is used many times and required many times to get seizures under control. So in that situation, you would want to do that. There are quite a few studies going on now, clinical trials of using the ketogenic diet in addition to standard care for many different types of cancer. Cancers love sugar. The cancer cells love sugar. Some cancer cells take up 200 times more sugar than normal cells. So the ketogenic diet can get you away from sugar, and the classic form of it, which gives the highest ketone levels, is being studied for people, to help slow down the tumor growth and that type of thing. So that's all in understudy. But I encourage people to aim for a lower level of ketones that's, maybe a fifth of what you would get, with a classic ketogenic diet. And, basically you eat more fat, but maybe try to keep your carbohydrate intake below 50 or 60 grams a day. If you add coconut and MCT oil, this can help sustain a level of mild ketosis. And then things like overnight fasting, intermittent fasting has become very popular for its health benefits. And one of the reasons it is healthy is because when you don't eat for at least 12 hours, you start, and you can drink fluids that don't have sugar or calories in them. But say overnight, you stop eating at 8 a.m. and maybe don't start eating again till 10 a.m. During that interval, you use up the glucose that's stored in your liver, and you start breaking down some fat, and you start producing some ketones from that. So you can wake up in mild nutritional ketosis. Some people will break that fast, breakfast is breaking your fast. And with coffee that has coconut or MCT oil in it, it even comes in powder form, which makes it really creamy. But you continue increasing your level of ketones by doing that, because it's only fat that you're eating. As soon as you eat anything with carbohydrate, it will kind of reverse your level of ketones. If you eat too much carbohydrate or sugar, it's just gone. You stop making ketones. So the tricky part is eating enough fat and reducing the amount of carbohydrate you eat. So I suggest that people, for example, look at the portion that you're eating. Americans have kind of supersized their diet and will eat a big plate full of pasta, a big bunch of mashed potatoes or something. And, look at the portions that you're eating. And one great way you can reduce your blood sugar is to cut your portion in half. And when you get used to that, cut it in half again. When you look at other countries, you think of in Asia that they eat a lot of rice. Well, they don't really eat a lot of rice. They have a little side serving of rice, in the US diet with if we eat Asian food, a lot of people will pile the rice on their plate and then put the food on top of it. So you want to cut that in half and then cut it in half again. And then you have a much more reasonable serving that will help, maintain mild ketosis, and add a little more healthy fats to your diet, like olive oil, avocados, nuts, seeds, have a lot of these monounsaturated fats that are really good for you, that type of thing. And then exercise is a great way to stimulate ketones. There are studies, they got interested in this almost 100 years ago. It's called post-exercise ketosis. If you do not eat a meal that's high in carbohydrate before you exercise, your body will break down some fat after you exercise, and your ketone level will come up mildly, and it will stay elevated for 8 or 9 hours. And there are many other benefits of ketones, many other things, something called BDNF that stimulates growth of brain cells and that type of thing that happen with exercise. So exercise is another way to increase ketones. There's a study, Dr. Cunane in Canada, who identified this brain energy gap and found that ketones are taken up normally in the Alzheimer brain. He also studied people with mild Alzheimer's. They did an exercise program on a treadmill 3 times a week. And at the end of the exercise, he was able to document that the exercise nearly tripled the ketone uptake in the brain. So not only do you produce ketones, but your brain takes them up eagerly, nearly triple. And if you add MCT oil, another study that he did in women, if you add MCT oil before the exercise, it increases even more the brain energy that you get from ketones. So several things like that. And there are ketone salts, ketone esters. Dr. Avicha's ketone ester did finally come out on the market. It's basically marketed to athletes for fitness. Some of the elite rowers in the Olympics have used his ketone ester. And in the Tour de France, a lot of the top people riding their bikes in the Tour de France have used ketone ester. But it's out there on the market. People who are dealing with a neurological problem, many people are trying it. They probably do not need the high doses that athletes use because if you think about it, they're running or they're biking, they're doing some very intense exercise and they're using energy very quickly. I have on my website, which we'll talk about, I have a page for Alzheimer's and dementia, and I have articles that I've written about using ketone salts and ketone esters, as well as using coconut and MCT oil. I have a diet that can be printed out. It's a variation of Dr. Westman's keto diet that helps people with diabetes. So those really are some of the things that you can do. So overnight fasting, exercise, eating a lower carb diet, and possibly taking coconut MCT oil and possibly supplements. And some of the people, I've had some people that have had very long-term results, like for years of improvement, and they started with coconut and MCT oil and then gradually added these other things: overnight fasting, lower carb diet, exercise, and in some cases supplements, in some cases not, and have maintained, improved and then maintained a problem like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. So there are people out there that are doing this, and it's successful. And I think it's a great way to prevent it. We're worried about getting it. So many of us. I mean, it runs strongly in my family.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I know that I have talked about is, the role that lifestyle plays in trying to prevent it. And I do think that most people agree that that is the best strategy. I would say for anyone listening that wants to start a keto diet, that they definitely need to work with their providers. They can check out your book. This is part one of a 3-part series that we're going to do. Your book is Clearly Keto for Healthy Brain Aging and Alzheimer's Prevention. We're going to have a link to your website, which is coconutketones.com. And your email is ketones08@gmail.com if people want to find more resources. But basically, this episode was about how a Mediterranean style diet and ketogenic strategies can change your life and increase your health span. And in our next 2 episodes, we're going to talk about other things that you can do, which we've introduced here. And then, how this type of diet can actually help you overcome some of the other things that we've talked about. So we're going to close out for this session, and then we will pick back up with the next one. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you for tuning in to This is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and if you'd like to learn more, you can check out my other episodes on my YouTube channel by subscribing and ringing the bell to get immediate notifications when new content comes out. In addition, you can also find the audio version of the podcast on Amazon Music, Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. Please feel free to leave an honest review, because more reviews mean more awareness of the podcast and helps us move towards an age-friendly world. If you have a comment or a question, you can visit my website, melissabphd.com. Go to the Contact Melissa tab, and you can leave me a voice message. You never know, it might just include your question or your comment in an upcoming episode.